Welcome. I'm your host, Henri Arslanian, and welcome to the special podcast exclusive edition of the Future Money podcast. I'm very excited today because I'm in Dubai with Frederik Gregaard, the CEO of the Cardano Foundation at the Cardano Summit 2023, which is here in Dubai. Frederik, great to have you on the show again.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
It was interesting because I think you were last on the show about 2 years ago. Smart contracts were just starting on Cardano. There's been a lot of developments. We were coming out of COVID. So it's really good to catch up with you today, live in person in Dubai. And I think my goal today for our listeners is really discuss what is the latest happening with Cardano and understand what are the latest developments that people that are in the space should know, and especially what is kind of the future outlook for the ecosystem. Not only for Cardano, but also your views on the broader ecosystem. Just also before we start, our regular disclaimers, companies that I own or assets that I own may hold Cardano as well, ADA. So just that regular disclosure that anything we say on the show should not be construed as financial advice. Fred, as we kick in, can you maybe, for the benefit of our audience, give us maybe a 30-second background on you and how do you end up being a CEO of the Cardano Foundation as a reminder for our audience?
So I was on the journey of democratizing access to capital markets, and I was building basically banks, and I was building asset managers, I was building funds and the rails for these things, and I could not understand why it was that people didn't want to have better products, they didn't want to have more lean operations, they want to have more happy clients, they want to make a bigger impact for the clients of banks and asset managers. And everybody was telling me, hey, it's the regulators, it's the auditors. So I said, I need to be having access to the best regulators and auditors sort of in the world. So I needed to join a Big Four. So I looked at it and I was like, okay, so who's the Big Four in Switzerland and who's the worst in my space, being a professional asset manager and infrastructure banker? And the worst in the space was PwC. So I basically cold called PwC and I said, you need me? And obviously they turned around and said, no, if you're not educated and trained in a Big Four, that won't really work. So it took me about 14 months to convince PwC that I'm the right guy and I could earn them a fortune of money, because this is how the Big Four works, right? It's sort of money flows up in the system. And as a part of that process of that many pitches, I needed to do like a list of clients I could bring or where I would actually be able to earn that money. It has to be very concrete. And on that list, I actually put Cardano. I didn't have any entry to Cardano. I didn't know Charles or anything like that. But from the outside, it looked like Cardano was not delivering. And I thought this must be something due to the regulatory or the audit part of it, because it was quite clear that Cardano would become the future infrastructure. And if that was the future infrastructure, there would be, something around operation resilience, there would be something around the regulatory part of the token economics and the utility tokens. Yeah. There would be something about, is it a security, is it not a security? There would be something around, is it a DAO and what is decentralization? So I thought if I work with the best auditors and the best lawyers, I can solve that. Now, then I started at PwC and I obviously didn't have contact to Cardano. So it was always sort of in the back of my head with this list of clients I wanted to make a difference for, which was also in accordance to the ethos of democratizing access to capital markets. So that is probably a part of the story.
And that's how we let it then. It's interesting. I remember when you were at PwC and all the efforts you were doing there. So now let's jump into the Cardano itself. I mean, when there's a lot of people, a lot of listeners who are looking at the crypto ecosystem, there's different layer ones out there. When somebody tells you, okay, how is Cardano different? What are the three main things that you think are different? What our audience should know from about those differences?
First thing you need to know, so point number one, Cardano is boring. What I mean Cardano is boring is that Cardano is an academic peer-reviewed blockchain. We issued over 180 peer-reviewed papers, and some of the largest blockchain projects in the world are using the research which we've published. And that also goes into sort of like centralized finance and so on. They're actually using some of the research we've done. That means that we are fairly slow, and I think that's a good thing. The second thing which you have to be aware of is that since we last spoke 2 years ago, we changed the code stack completely on Cardano, while over thousands of companies have deployed on Cardano. So basically, think about if you have an airplane, we've changed the engine while we were flying it. And what I want to say with this is that Cardano actually has an uptime of over 2,000 days. So over 2,000 days, Cardano has not been down. In fact, on the version of Cardano we're on right now, Cardano has never been down. And the only other infrastructure I'm aware of as being an infrastructure banker and being, used to critical infrastructure who is able to have a track record like that is actually Bitcoin. Any other infrastructure, Oracle, IBM, Facebook, you name it, has been down, but not Cardano. And the third thing what you have to be aware of is that Cardano is actually the blockchain who has the most code changes of any of the large projects out there. So we measure that on GitHub, right? And you can then say, yeah, but it's only important if it's a relevant code change. But I think what's important is because we are a sort of a boring blockchain, right? The fact that we still can do all these code changes to refine the product to market fit, to ensure that we can not just be, something for the financial sector, but we can also be something for agro, for industry, for supply chain, for nation states who's looking at new voting systems. And for that, you need to be able to adapt and adjust based on the trends you see in the social systems around the world, but also the macroeconomic landscape, which has dramatically changed in the last 12 months as we look at it.
Absolutely. I think what you're calling as being boring, it's interesting because I remember in our interview 2 years ago, you mentioned about evidence-based development, right? Really how we look at actually making sure things are doing properly, just being peer-reviewed, which is a different approach to how we develop. And I think that's what obviously resonates with the community right now and the approach that has been taken from that perspective.
Yeah, and then when you look at sort of the Cardano Foundation, and what we've been championing in a part of that is that you need to do some trade-offs, right? So some of the trade-offs we've done is that, we're not moving away from Haskell. Haskell is a very sort of unique and very specific coding language, which, probably would never find a lot of adoption. So what we've done instead is we actually ensured that we have a growing Rust community, and we have a lot of good Rust repositories, right? We have a growing Python community, and the Cardano Foundation just actually published 2 Java libraries. So we built quite a lot of things, sort of database synchronization and other things in Java, and we made that open source, including the documentation of that, right? So what you're basically seeing now is that, a lot of sort of new languages are coming, which is sort of established, and we created a new one, which is called Icon. So Icon is actually a smart contracting language, which we've been bootstrapping from the Cardano Foundation. And we spoke to some Solidity developers who's been looking at that, and they say, oh, hold on, this is actually easier than Solidity, but it's actually verifiable, right? So this is a really, really nice trade-off, and we saw that we've done that for less than a year now. It's already live. We already have DEXs and AMMs and others who's deployed on that, and we have really industrial-grade projects who's seeing that this is 10 times faster and 10 times cheaper than what we actually did with the original implementation of Plutus, which is native to Haskell.
Interesting. And I remember at the time you were mentioning how with Haskell, it was how such a small percentage of the population are developers, and then what a minute percentage of that even is actually into crypto and blockchain, right? Yeah. So I can see how that plays a big role. So let's think about more, before I move on to more strategic questions, is maybe can you share with our audience, what is the state of the ecosystem right now? How many users coming in, like on the since you guys launched smart contracts, and how does that how do you see that evolution going from that perspective on a user base?
I give you a few numbers just on top of my head, right? So if I look at where we were last year, so not since smart contracts, but where we were last year to now, right? We've seen actually that we've been in a quite large bear market, right? There's been a lot of insecurity, and maybe some of the hype of blockchain has gone a little bit away. And I think this is probably the year of AI and large language models, right? So if you look at that into that perspective, we had over 200,000 new non-custodial wallets who were added to the Cardano ecosystem, and the number is probably much higher if you look at custodial wallets, right? Because we cannot sort of measure what banks and DeFi and exchanges are doing, but on the non-custodial is over 200,000. If you look at the TVL, which is kind of interesting, when we spoke last time, we had no TVL, right? Because there was no smart contracts, right? But TVL compared to last year is up about 200%. Another thing which is very interesting is Cardano is one of the blue chip, if I may say so, blockchains out there who do not have an industrial grade stablecoin. Now, you would say, oh, hey, this is a big problem or a big opportunity. I would say, how can it be that one of the largest blockchain in the world do not have a USDC or Tether? Well, this is actually because the community has so much faith in the projects, but also in the core stack we have. So that's the only reason we can stay in this position without having one of those large mastodons. Does that mean that we shouldn't have one? No. We are working on some of these things, and the community itself has made some really good projects around both algorithmic stablecoins and also asset-backed stablecoins and so on. But I think this is an observation from the outside which you might not find in a Messari or another sort of outside review, because this is really related to the strength of the community, but also the faith in the community. What we also see is that the amount of, we have a developer portal, and maybe you can put a link into the developer portal, right? But we're sort of tracking about 113, 114 different projects across all industries, which is unique, right? It's not hard to find, 200, 300 NFT projects, right? But these 113, 14 projects is really where you say, okay, this is actually a unique implementation on Cardano with a specific use case, a specific implementation of a code base. And you can actually get that on the developer portal, and you can get some inspiration. Further to that, what we've seen is that we launched a RegTech tool for regulators. I was sort of thinking, Mika is going along, is sort of in a pretty good state. But when we checked into Brussels, what we saw was that the discussion was really being led by regulated exchanges and not by layer ones. And we had to change that. So we built a RegTech tool in sort of with the guidance and collaboration from the MIS and from the FCA and a couple of other regulators. And we published that now, because what we saw is that you cannot go into a regulator and say, if you cannot read the code, go away. I mean, this is not how society works, right? Society is extremely complicated, and there's a lot of stakeholders who need to be protected and managed at any given time. But the fact that we now have this RegTech tool, which shows the exact staking lifecycle, including counterparties, including ownership chains, the fact that Cardano has no slashing, it has no lock-in period. How do you prove that? Will you be accepting that I come with a PowerPoint show? Now you have the exact workflow, and they can go all the way back to the blockchain and verify that. So we've done quite a few things where we saw that, the unusual or not the normal people you'll be looking at in terms of data points is starting to really pay attention to Cardano. And that's now also, regulators and policymakers who's really onboarding into Cardano in terms of who we are, what we do, and why we are different. And we are seeing we're being invited to many of these talks and many of these collaborations, not as a part of an association, but we are directly at the table. I was just with ESMA, EBA, FINMA, those people, because they want to understand that. And what is really unique is that they're asking questions around DORA and other things. So they're really saying, so DeFi and financial services is one thing. But what if a bank actually chooses to skip the entire infrastructure and build it on a blockchain? How does that work? What about SOC 2? Right about, those aspects. And I think this is an unknown data point, but it's a very important data point from outsiders, because we are being seen as the grown up in the room in many of these talks. We're not the only one, right? But we have a very specific focus on that.
Because you're right. I think as an ecosystem, often it was some of these centralized players, or actually people with a vested interest that were actually advocating or talking to regulators. And actually, this has many criticism, especially in certain parts like in the US, where kind of the favors itself. And we're having the same debate right now with AI, where some of the large players are there promoting certain regulations, which may act as a barrier to entry to others. But actually, you mentioned topic of financial services. And on our show, we've had many people in the crypto ecosystem looking at building the financial services of the future. When it comes to Cardano, for example, if you imagine 20 years down the line, how do you think our financial system will look when it comes to its interaction with, let's call it, not only layer ones like Cardano, but digital assets more broadly? And what do you think role, Frederik, Cardano will play in this ecosystem?
I think in general, financial services and banking are late adopters. And I was trying to push that for many, many years, right? We even had a dedicated team in the foundation to try and ensure that the banks were actually more inventive in how they deploy a third generation blockchain, right? I mean, we have the ability with the switch of one button to basically end shadow banking as we know it, right? Because what we can do in Cardano is we can take what you think about as the SWIFT system, the messaging protocol, right? And what you think about is the transactions. Those live in banking in two complete different systems, right? And we can actually merge that together to be inseparable. Now, so it's not a technology question anymore, right? It's a question of users, it's a question of people. And I think banking is sort of a late adopter. The way I think about it is we have to go back a little bit to the basics and say, I think there's an argument where you say all companies in the world are turning into fintech companies. And if all companies are turning into fintech companies, then I think the road in there will be much more around supply chain, authenticity, certificates of conformity and standards. So I think there's a big supply chain use case on the table right now which can be ported directly into financial markets. I was in Georgia last week and spoke to the central bank, and I spoke to the Ministry of Economy and so on, because we've done a use case there where we're putting 100,000 bottles of wine on the Cardano blockchain from 22 different wineries. And that's this is one of the classic use cases where people say, oh, we could do that on blockchain. No, we actually done that. You can find that in there. And that's not what's special about it. What's special is that the Ministry of Agriculture with the National Wine Agency, they are signing with a digital signature that this bottle of wine has gone through these processes, which allows them to say this is an export bottle of wine, that particular bottle. And if you go into finance, right, think about issuance of bonds or co-collateralization and so on. What you're really having here is that you have these handshakes among auditors, where the auditors are saying, oh, you can trust this balance sheet, right? If you can trust this balance sheet, you can trust the collateral, right? And that means that the bank is now having a handshake, the auditor is having a handshake, and the company is having a handshake, right? And you have, after the financial crisis of 2008, you have some of these entities emerging like Glyph, like the digital entity identifier and others, who sort of supposed to say, yeah, this is the passport of a company, right? And when you start being able to have these digital handshakes, right, and you're putting that into a supply chain thing, what you can do is you can change the way you verify trust in financial services, specifically in capital markets. So I think this idea about crypto assets and tokenization, it will go a little bit further, right? But I think the real thing now is coming from the background of the supply chains and the sort of the back end. Yeah. Think about the central security deposits. Yeah. In the European Union, we have 32 or 31 central security deposits. You cannot tell Italy that they have to close it down, they have to use one in Brussels, right? Yeah. It doesn't work like that. And none of them work on the same infrastructure. That means that when you're settling stocks, right, you can be 3-4 months between back offices, right, where you cannot, close your order, there's no stop losses, etc. We have the technology to do that. Now, what we are talking about here is an asymmetry in business relationships. Yeah. Now, the CSD from Italy will not work with the CSD from France, who will not work with the CSD from Germany, because there is an asymmetry in the power balance. And that is exactly what public permissionless blockchains is addressing. That they know that nobody is bigger than the other one, and we're all on equal terms. And this is actually what we think about as equitable growth in financial market infrastructure across bases. And that's where public blockchains are more powerful than others.
And absolutely can play a big role as well on that front. Fred, we're literally running out of time. One last question before I move my fire round of questions, my traditional fire round of questions. My last question is, there's a lot of public listeners of our show who are people working in banks and financial institutions, regulators and others, who are saying, okay, I want to build this X solution, but then I have to choose my layer one. And of course, the default choice, often people go towards Ethereum, for example. It's there, it's big, nobody gets fired for building on Ethereum. It's there, everybody knows it. What is the one thing you tell individuals like these why they should look at Cardano and at least consider it on what projects they want to build?
So I'm actually trying to divert from these discussions now, because Ethereum is just so big and Solidity is there, right? And yeah, as you said, you are not getting fired for that, right? But if people are really serious, right, I tend to listen to where they sit in the ecosystem. When I say the ecosystem, this is sort of the life cycle of a bank, right? And then I give them a piece of advice which they were not aware of and which they cannot just read, because it's impossible to get this kind of information without being in the engine room. So if you are sitting in the compliance or the legal department right now and you say, why should I choose Cardano over Ethereum? I would say, what? One of the big roles and duties of a bank is to think about front running and those kind of things. There's a very odd term which is called unspent transaction output, which nobody really understands what it is in a bank. But you know what that gives you? You cannot do front running on Cardano because UTXO simply do not allow it. Yeah. Now, Ethereum is account-based. So, of course, it's possible to do that because it works as the financial infrastructure of today. So I tend to try and leave a little gold nugget where I speak their language, but I put attention to a certain feature of Cardano to kind of get them to get a little bit into the rabbit hole. And then the other thing I tell them is, go to an education which is teaching you about third-generation blockchains. And the Cardano Foundation has just launched a free education initiative about that. And when you learned about third-generation blockchains, the second thing you need to do is you need to go specific. And I think you just launched a new book, which is very specific around Bitcoin. And I think the right order of doing that is start with third generation blockchains and then you read Henri's book. But if you read Henri's book and then you do third generation, your mind will not be able to open up for this supply chain game, and you will stay on the asset issuance side. And then you have not gotten the full understanding of what blockchain can do for you.
And I think you're right. People often, like in traditional finance as well, the way they get trained, the way, if you're an auditor, your accountant, you think a certain way. If you're a lawyer, you think of a certain way. If you're a developer, you think of a certain way. And actually, ironically, we're starting to see that in the crypto ecosystem as well. Yeah. Fred, we're going to finish up quickly with my 5-round question. I need 1 or 2 word answers, and then we're going to move quickly on those. Hope you're ready.
Yeah, go for it.
Fred, you're originally from Denmark. What is the one thing you love the most from that country?
So it's called a dark bread open sandwich.
Dark bread open sandwich.
Yeah.
I think the Google search of that topic may go up in the next couple of days. You spend a lot of time in Switzerland. What is the one thing you love the most? What's the one thing you love doing the most in Switzerland?
It's the 4 seasons in the mountains.
Yeah, exactly. I remember you told me at the Larry show, you saved people in an avalanche. What's your favorite place to ski?
The border between Switzerland and Italy on the backside of the Matterhorn.
Here we go. If you're not into crypto or financial services, what other industry you'd be in?
World trade and supply chain.
Wow, I love it. If you could go back to university today, what is the one course you recommend young people take that often people don't take in university or schools?
Can I say 2?
Yeah, of course. Same price, might as well.
Yeah. So I think it's back to what Plato, the old Greek person, said around the argument. So how you construct an argument, and I think specifically in the world of large language models, you need to be able to see through this argumentation, because you will not know what the truth is in the future. And then the second course, so this is a little bit on the philosophical side, right? And the other is hardcore statistics. The ability to understand statistical calculation is something I've been using every single day, and I hated it when I was in school, but I use it every single day to call bullshit, because everybody throws around numbers, but if you have the ability to understand statistics, you can call bullshit.
I love it. Elon Musk gives you a call. What do you tell him?
I give him the opportunity to understand why Cardano is superior and will lower the cost of operations for his spaceship missions.
Last one, Sam Bankman-Fried gives you a call. He's in deep shit right now. What do you tell him?
I told you so.
And the last one to get Frederik Gregaard, the CEO of the Cardano Foundation, on the Future Money podcast today. Fred, if you could have lunch or dinner with one person, dead or alive, lunch or dinner with one person, dead or alive, who would you have lunch or dinner with?
I probably have to say Arnold Schwarzenegger. I saw his Netflix documentary, and it really blew me away. I had a complete different view of who he was. But after seeing that, I think I would like to understand a little bit about his core, motivation and how he moved through his career as he did.
Yeah, here we go from Austria. If Arnold Schwarzenegger, if you're listening, I think Fred is happy to take you out for lunch on that perspective. Thank you very much, Fred. Thanks for being with us today. We're at the Cardano Foundation Dubai Summit 2023. Really, thanks for being with us on the show. For anybody listening on the show, thank you once again for making this podcast now in the top 5% of podcasts globally on Spotify. And make sure to check us out on YouTube as well, where we have a lot of exclusive content as well on Henri Arslanian. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for being with us. And then see you soon on another episode of the Future Money Podcast.